All right, we'll get started. Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you to the Western New York Book Arts Center for putting on this show. I continue to just kind of be in awe of seeing all this work up here for the first time. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I'd only ever seen these pieces sort of sequentially as I was taking them out of one box and putting them into another. So seeing them in a gallery where they belong is really special. Nancy also wrote the essay in the booklet. There are still several available, so make sure everybody, if you don't have one already, those were printed right here downstairs at Winnipeg, and it's a really wonderful essay and wonderful introduction to Cindy's work. Nancy, I wanted to open by asking you, just to give us a little context, when did you first come into contact with Cindy, and also how did your sort of correspondence evolve over time?
Well, to be honest, I never met Cindy in person. I only heard about her. My connection was always with Andy DePaulsey. I visited him at his studio in Brooklyn when I was organizing an exhibition on collage about 1990 that it was produced at the then called Birchfield Art Center. And he was one of the artists, and you know, it was really great. I had known him before he moved to Brooklyn through halls mainly, and just connections. There was a little show of his work that was at the Birchfield that I think Mr. Castellani bought 2 pieces from that show, and we eventually acquired some pieces too. But I knew about Cindy, but I didn't know that she was creating any kind of art. So it was really through this incredible book that you should all read that Aidan wrote. It's an incredible chronicle of their lives as well as the art scene in Buffalo in the 60s, 70s, 80s, leading up, using them and their connections in the art world here, and how it really expanded. They both died way too young. Andy had better recognition, I think, in Germany and Europe than he did here locally, but both really interesting artists. And it was a real treat to get to see these works at Aidan's place for the very first time. It was kind of a revelation. We didn't know that she did work, and obviously I've had an interest in collage for a long time, so it just drew me in. I was really thankful to be asked to write this essay for this exhibition, and I hope you guys will all enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. Well, the sort of critical engagement with Cindy's work I found in writing this book was quite limited. I think there was, a line or two by Tony Bannon in a short review in the Buffalo News of an early exhibition, and later in a newspaper called the Brooklyn Phoenix, there were a couple lines, devoted to Cindy when she had a few pieces shown at the Brooklyn War Memorial Rotunda. Besides my book, which is not really, I think, like a critical book in that sense, what the essay you wrote is the first critical treatment at length of Cindy's work, which I think is exciting and a really wonderful place to start. I wrote in the book a little bit about how critical engagement in the arts can be a bit of a double-edged sword. If you get too much critical attention of the wrong kind, you can sort of be captured by that as an artist and just start producing what the critics say is good. Or you can be misunderstood, and as an artist that feels bad, and you can sort of retreat from the sting of that. But also, if you have no critical engagement, you may be lost to time, right, which was sort of the risk here. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about a couple places for people to begin engaging with Cindy's work, because I think that may be the best benefit of scholarship and criticism at this time. It's just sort of throwing a couple doors open. So I wonder if you could say what some of those doors might be for Cindy.
Sure. I guess I would maybe start with a little bit of background on myself and interest. I was finishing up my undergraduate career when really the feminist movement started, and there were some critical essays asking, why have there been no great women artists? And it was a rhetorical question. When I took my survey art history course at Syracuse University, we used Jansen's History of Art. And that was this big tome, this thick, art from over the millennia, from cave painting to a little bit of 20th century art. 2 women were included in that vast history of time. And it was very clear that there had to be more than 2 women who made contributions. So one of the ways that I was looking at Cindy's work was within that framework. She was a little younger than me, but really somebody who would be subject to that kind of prejudice and the difficulty for women artists to be recognized, to get shows, to be written about. So that was one of the approaches that I was taking. I knew it was going to be a long essay, so I didn't get into lots and lots of detail, but I wanted to mention some of the forerunners of that. I also became quite intrigued with the Guerrilla Girls movement in New York. For those of you who don't know them, these were women artists and art historians who were using guerrilla warfare, G-U-E-R, but they wore gorilla, the animal, heads so that they could protest anonymously. But they gave themselves names like Georgia O'Keeffe, and it was a way for them to really bring to public attention the inequities. That they criticized the Museum of Modern Art, and they kept statistics on how many exhibitions had been given to women, how many women were included in survey shows, how many women artists' artworks did they acquire. And it was abysmal numbers, but they were at it and critiquing the field in New York. So that was one way that I thought we could look at her art. Another was through, because she uses these elements of nature in so many of the collages, that the whole idea of using nature as a vehicle and responding. Some of that, I think, had to do with their moving to Callicoon after 9/11. So they went from Brooklyn, she bought a home, it was within a week, 10 days or something like that. They were both, I'm kind of going backwards in the way I'm presenting this, but they were both in New York City when the towers were bombed and fell. And the trains back to Brooklyn were not functioning. And they had to walk home through all of this debris in the air and just the horrible experience of the chaos and not knowing what was happening. So she went ahead and bought a home, southern part of the Catskills, I think you would call it, just to get out of the city. They had to move. It was just way too disturbing. And I think that, as well as other factors, contributed to both of them having cancer. And Andy died several years before Cindy. But that idea of going to nature, there are a number of artists that go to nature to try to make sense of their lives and connect in a meaningful way. So that was another way of looking at some of the imagery that she uses with the forests and the stones and the riverbeds. Also just her identity as a woman, and female sexuality and revealing herself, a kind of vulnerability that I think comes across in a lot of the works. And I draw some connections, at least locally. There were artists like Shirley Kessman. I'm not sure if she actually studied with Shirley Kessman at Buffalo State, but Shirley was in the art department there, and somebody who had suffered sexism during her stay. So there were artists like that who were among the first that were really dealing with this idea of female identity and how they represented that in their art. And then there are others like, I mentioned Frida Kahlo, for example, and a number of her self-portraits, where someone like Shirley Kessman didn't always use figures. Sometimes her work was more abstract. But Frida Kahlo, I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of her self-portraits and very, the ways that she depicted her both physical pain, because she had been in a horrible accident and had been pierced by this hole from a bus that went through her body, and she dealt with pain all her life. But then there was the emotional pain and the ups and downs of her marriage with Diego Rivera, and the way that she reveals her heart with her looking through her torso to expose her emotions. So I wanted to compare her with some of the precedents, some of the other female artists and surrealists. And, I just think there are so many different ways that you can look at her art. And of course, it's very personal, very subjective when we look at other people's art, and she didn't leave behind a written record. I am the world expert on Charles Birchfield, but I have the benefit of correspondence and 10,000 pages of journals and painting indexes and all kinds of historical records where others have interpreted his work, but it's also his own language of describing how he, what he intended in some of his artwork. We don't have any of that for Cindy, so it's what you might read in the essay is bringing my experiences and artists that I've known and the bit of feminist art history that I'm familiar with. That's my lens looking at these works. And of course, I would recommend that everyone respond with their own opinions. Like, how did you respond? I don't want to do all the talking here. You did incredible research trying to track down their history, but how did you respond to some of these? Some speak to you more than others.
Yeah, I mean, that's changing all the time. I think this particular body of work rewards returning again and again. You brought up connections in your essay that I hadn't considered at all, like, for example, Frida Kahlo and the use of the heart coming out of the body in that way. Like, it now seems obvious that there's a connection there. I think one doesn't necessarily need those connections to appreciate this, but I'm glad that I keep coming back and finding new things to think about. You mentioned in the essay the Czech artist Yuri Kolar.
Yeah,
So Cindy exhibited internationally only once. It was in 1990 in a gallery called Gallery Schopenhauer in Cologne, Germany. And there's an interesting story as to how that came about. My wife Rochelle and I were in Germany a couple weeks ago, and I got to speak to that gallerist, Crystal Schopenhauer, who chose Cindy's work and brought it there. And just as you described for yourself, Crystal Schopenhauer was first introduced to Andy, and she flew from Germany, came to Brooklyn, she was visiting artist studios, and she came to visit Andy's studio. And Andy said, oh, come over here, check out what Cindy is doing. And at the time, Cindy was doing what Crystal called concrete poetry. So this would be collage, but using text, using language. And Crystal had just finished putting together a show called Wortlaut, which in German means wording, but she was interested in concrete poetry. It was a whole show of concrete poetry, and she said, I wish I knew about this earlier. I would have put Cindy's work, many pieces of Cindy's work in this show. That wasn't possible, but her next show was this homage to Yuri Kolar, a Czech artist who was innovated a lot in collage, and so both Andy and Cindy were included there. It was, learning about that was kind of bittersweet because it was one of those many near misses in Cindy's career as an artist where she could have had more recognition. But to think that Crystal, remembers that and thinks about it in that context now is also great. So, but that said, I know very little about Yuri Kolar, so I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that connection.
Yeah, it's interesting, the serendipity that there was this connection with Kolar because from one of my I didn't grow up in Buffalo, so I don't remember exactly when it was that I first visited the Albright Knox Art Gallery, as it was known then. Probably sometime in the 70s after I moved to Western New York. And one of the artists who fascinated me was Yuri Kolar, whose work there were a few works that were exhibited in a display case in the sculpture court. And there's, I'm forgetting the name of it, I mentioned it here, the sculpture of a head. It's covered, it's sort of like the cycladic heads. I'm not sure if it was called cyclad.
Yeah, I remember.
And so he took pieces of text and they coat the surface, but then there are other elements. And I was just fascinated with this artist, and then I found, they had this exhibit of his in the 1970s. I didn't see the exhibit, but I got the catalog and I was so fascinated. He really pushed collage. And of course, I was into it for my collage show. Collage officially began with Picasso and Gris. But he created all kinds of new effects that could be made by cutting up an image and then cutting it in all of these little vertical strips, but then alternating how they were pasted onto a board. I think that one's called roulage, and there's, I should probably read what they are, because I don't remember all the terminology. But he really changed the field of collage quite a bit. Here we are. Explaining. Yeah, chismage, confrontage, froissage, and roulage. So he lived from 1914 to collage officially was invented in 1912 by art historians. So he was one of the very first to really use this art form. And the fact that she was inspired by and exhibited with Kolar's work, I thought was just absolutely fascinating because of my own personal interests. And the show that the Albright did had been organized by Charlotta Cotique, who is a curator. She was from Czechoslovakia. And so, and she was one of the people I studied with when I was getting my master's at UB. So just kind of full circle to have all of these connections that seem to come up through Cindy's work.
Yeah, the work, I need to put these pictures online. The work Cindy was making that was incorporating concrete poetry and collage that was more obviously in conversation with Yuri Kolar is still in Crystal Schopenhauer's collection. She sent me some pictures, so I can put this online.
Okay.
It's interesting. It's in conversation with this work here, but it doesn't look anything like it because there's text first of all and no self-portraiture.
And that's another interesting serendipitous connection. When I was getting my master's at UB, I had a non-teaching assistantship in the rare book and poetry collection room, and my job was to create a bibliography on concrete poetry. So I've had a great interest in that as well, and a few years later, I organized an exhibition for the Birchfield called Robert Lax and Concrete Poetry, and we borrowed a number of things from UB's collection, the poetry collection, and Robert Lax was a concrete poet born in Western New York, but had become, after being in a circus and having all these different aspects to his life, ended up becoming a priest who lived in Greece, and he came for the exhibition, and there were programs, and it was really fascinating. And we also commissioned, through the poetry collection, some concrete poems, and a few of those examples are now in our collection at Virtual Penny. So just another fascinating topic. I get interested in all this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm obviously very eclectic person.
Cindy, you mentioned this before, but I want to underscore the point for everybody. In writing this book, I found nothing that Cindy had ever said about her own work. Her husband, Andy Topolsky, also said very little about his own work that was ever recorded. One of the things he did say was that I'm paraphrasing, is that his work was a progression. Every piece led into the next piece. And in looking at his body of work, that seems very obvious, actually, that the works on paper seem like designs for the sculptures, and the sculptures then move and make music and blah, 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 it just goes on. But I think about that with respect to Cindy's work, too. Especially the more I learn about it, understanding that she was interested in, collage in the 90s and also in the 2004s, right, 2008 and on, that she was interested in the architecture of churches in the late 70s, early 80s, and still interested in the late 90s. So there are these connections, but if her work was a progression, as Andy's was, it was a progression repeatedly interrupted and arrested, creating these large gaps in the record that we sort of have to jump over. So, given your extensive work with so many artists who are around to explain what they meant, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how one thinks about presenting work like this, when the artist isn't here to say, well, this goes on this wall and that goes on that wall.
Well, some of it is just looking at what is happening in the art world at the time, what they may or may not have been influenced by, either overtly or just it's in the ether. I personally think Andy didn't get recognized in the same way that some of the Hall Walls artists, and Cindy too, Cindy Schumann and Robert Longo, is that the art scene in New York at that time was all about gigantic scale, very in-your-face artwork. I was getting back to representation after being conceptual and not representational at all. And Andy was very conceptual, very intellectual. His work is loaded with symbolism, and to explain part of what he was doing for a while. He was also a musician and composer, and performed in a kind of poetic, nonlinear way. But the work that I was exhibiting for the collage show that really continued as an approach that he took throughout his life was he would find a text, like a government text about nuclear weapons or nuclear sites where weapons were stored underground, stuff like that. And he would take all the letters, all the vowels, or all the letters of musical staff, A for G, and block out, in the text. And then those letters would be entered into both graphs, musical graphs, as well as mathematical kinds of graphs. And then he would create these arcs and he would do these very precise kind of drawings, but then there would be these smudges. You could tell that a human hand was working on it. But he would, for some of the more sculptures or collage-like work, there might be sand to represent the deserts in which these missiles were stored, or how glass is melted sand, so he would use glass panels to put some of his artwork on it, as well as the things that he did on paper. And I think it was just so loaded but not obvious to the general public, and so not saleable in a New York super gallery environment. And so he had to take it other places in New York where they were more open to that kind of tradition, and perhaps because of traditions of concrete poetry and that kind of artwork that was very popular in Europe, as well as fluxes and some of the more conceptual art movements. And understanding through Aiden's book, Cindy really subjugated herself in many ways to become Andy's business partner, to help with getting notices about his artwork out there, about doing the books. And she had her own profession too, her own job. So she was helping to support them, but also kind of putting herself second in trying to help his career, because especially at that time, I've known quite a few married couples that it's usually male artist who is prioritized in exhibitions and sales and things like that, and the female artist takes a back seat and supports her husband's work. I think we could maybe say something like that existed with John Fall and Bonnie Gordon, although Bonnie was very, very reluctant to show her work. I convinced her to do a show a few years ago. So I don't want to blame John, I love John's work, but there are these dynamics that I think have played out in the art world over decades where that becomes the case. I think I've lost my train of thought.
Well, that's all right, because it brings me to something else that I thought was really interesting in your essay. You point out, and this is sort of part of that feminist and biographical reading, you point out the appearance of the embroidery hoop in several of these works, and you mentioned that this is an expression of a way that women and women artists, but also just women generally, have expressed themselves for a very, very, very long time without necessarily an expectation that it would be exhibited or an expectation of compensation. That was also something I don't think I noticed the first time I looked at these. I saw that in the context of Cindy using material that was close at hand.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't necessarily think about the symbolism of the embroidery hoop as such. In reading your essay, I was thinking about the biographical readings and the feminist reading. I think there's sometimes a risk in going first to those lenses with women artists because it becomes foregrounded to the exclusion of other things, right? You know, the woman poet is always the speaker of her poems, that kind of thing. Like the art is always autobiographical. And of course, we know that's not true. I do think, though, sometimes, and that's why I'm so glad you included, for example, the Yuri Kolar. You know, there's so much more. But at the same time, I think this work does seem to be autobiographical. It seems to be asking for that reading, too. And if that's what Cindy intended, then we should probably enter through that door. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, how we balance these different ways of reading works like this.
Yeah, I think you raise an interesting point. I mentioned the embroidery hoop because women, now textiles are getting a bit more attention and respect, I think. But they were the anonymous artists creating quilts and embroidery. This is one of the very few avenues that they were given that they could do. But I think because she never, she didn't title these, they were stored in a box. She didn't try to exhibit them, led me to believe that there was this private aspect to them. She was doing them for herself. She was, especially in the later years, she thought she had gotten over her cancer, and it came back, and dealing with Andy's and his death, and then the incredible fear. I mean, they had a few friends in Callicoon, and sometimes friends would come to visit, but I got the sense that there was this sense of isolation that some of the works, at least to me, exhibit fear of the unknown. But that said, I also feel the connection with nature as possibly being one of the ways that she could have some sense of resolution, that she could get through this, that she knew what the end of her journey was going to be, that inevitable death when you're dealing with cancer, and when family members have died of cancer. And she did have a Catholic background, but the way I read some of these works, I think that was not, her background was not giving her comfort, it was not providing the answers. I think it was nature for her that she used as means. And, you know, that could just be my skewed perspective, because that's how I see Birchfield's work. He had rejected organized religion for the first about 50 years of his life, and then converted to his wife's religion. But the way that he talks about nature, writes about nature, and represents nature, I think, is through this kind of pantheistic way, really finding spiritual strength through connecting with nature. And, you know, that's my, again, another one of my lenses in looking at her work, and the kind of background that I come from. And trying to read, you know, trying to connect with the work in a way that it is meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to stay on the embroidery hoop for just another minute, because it led me to what I felt like was kind of a beautiful reorientation toward some of Cindy's working history. And that is that for most of my time researching this book, I thought about Cindy's artistic output in terms of those gaps in the record. That, you know, she stops making art when they move from Broadway and Brooklyn to North 7, because there isn't room for two people to have a studio, so Andy gets the studio. You know, she's not able to make art because of working, because of various health issues. And so, you know, I thought about those gaps. But a friend of Cindy's told me that even when she wasn't making art, she was always creative and putting out creative stuff into the world. They gave the example that, you know, they sent her like a fancy chocolate bar as a gift, and she sent them back this sort of ornate origami thank you card made from the wrapper. And I think of that, and I think of the embroidery hoops, and I realized, actually, it's yes, there were gaps in terms of recognized output, but she was making stuff the whole time, and thinking about art the whole time. And so when she had the time and space to come back to a studio, of course the output is going to be this prolific and this, you know, mature. I think, I wanted to acknowledge that aspect of the embroidery hoop as well. The other aspect of this body of work I wondered if we could talk about is the self-portraiture, because while, as I said, there is a continuity, self-portraiture absolutely does not appear in Cindy's work until about 2008. That's the one element that just wasn't present before. The collage was present before, the religious symbolism and architecture was present before, even the nature was present before, but not the self-portraiture. I wondered if you could talk about Cindy's work in the context of the tradition of self-portraiture, and maybe how you think about this body sort of appearing out of nowhere.
Interesting. I think perhaps it came at a time in her life when she was feeling very vulnerable, and self-portraiture goes back so far with so many people. That's when I turned to some of the artists, a generation or so older than her, like Leonora Carrington, Frida Kahlo, as a way that she would have been aware of their work, of course, a way that they represented life both through their kind of experience, but making it more universal. And I think that's what she was trying to do here. Since these were private, they're not titled, they weren't exhibited, they're kind of hidden away. They become a visual journal in some respect. You went to their home in Cancun, you probably recognize some of the stream beds and trees and some of the views that are in the background. But then, while there's this element that truly reflects her experience as an individual, I think there's a real effort to create iconography that is more universally experienced, or even just making decisions like the moths that appear in some of these, and thinking about a moth's existence as a night creature. And moths, because I'm organizing an exhibition on Birchfield's insects and spiders, I'm very interested in things like moths, and the cicadas that are in this work. But moths, most moths don't even have mouths. They only live for maybe a week or two after they come out of the chrysalis. Their only function in life is to mate and lay eggs and start the next generation. So they have a very small, mysterious kind of life cycle. Maybe she knew some of that and was identifying with it. But also the fact that she was taking these remnants, the dead insects and the feathers and the twigs and little stones, I think, are in some of them. These are the little objects that are from her daily experience. And so inserting those, but making it more of a universal, in some I say, well, maybe she's like a nature goddess. There are others where you can just read it several different ways. So there's always something personal in it, but I think her intention was to make it, make these images that anyone could identify with. And yes, she's female, but I think males could project their experiences onto it as well.
Yeah. There's one last element in this series I want to just point out for folks. I'd love to see if there are any questions from the audience before I have one final question for you. And that the last element I want to point out has to do with the self-portraiture. I'm not certain about this, but those who've read the book will know that it opens with this scene told in the present tense that takes place in like late 2007. Andy would have had advanced cancer at that point and would be passing away soon. Cindy is taking a picture of Andy against a wall in the apartment. And it's clearly something they're collaborating on, like where to position him, where to put the camera. Andy, too, didn't really engage in self-portraiture. I don't think I've ever seen any example of like finished work that was self-portraiture. He was a photographer, he did an MFA in photography, but that wasn't how he spent most of his time after that period. But he returned to it late in life. I found out through multiple friends who told me that he was working on a series of self-portraits that required Cindy's help, obviously, to take them. It was sort of documenting the way his body was changing because of the cancer. So it was very morbid interest. It's unclear what he was going to do with them. He obviously didn't have time to finish that work, and I don't know where the work is. But immediately after that experience, Cindy would have started working on these. And I came to learn that Cindy, not only was a business partner to Andy, she definitely was, but was also an intellectual partner in the studio. She was deeply involved in his own artistic output. He was always bouncing ideas off of her. They were having conversations about what they were each trying to do. And she was just very enmeshed in the actual production of his work, not just the sale of it. And so a part of me thinks that while this is absolutely Cindy's work and it is autobiographical and deeply personal, it may represent some kind of continued dialogue with Andy in the immediate aftermath of his passing, and that she turns to self-portraiture, out of nowhere when he had just been doing that.
I think that's very plausible. She did have photography background as a student, so they did have that in common, and of course, they were totally aligned in any sort of socio-political dialogue, intending to, I think ultimately make the world better through revealing some of the horrors of life. I didn't know about Andy's attempt at self-portraiture or this chronicling. From people that I've known with cancer, it changes your life so much, and you become so self-reflexive and thinking of her work as extending through her experience, something that he was going through, again, something that they shared. I think that's a very insightful conclusion.
Well, are there any questions from the audience before we close this up? Yeah.
Can you just give like a time frame for all this? So he passed away in like 07, 08?
08.
08, and then these were 08 to 12, roughly?
There's some evidence that Cindy may have begun working on this a little bit before Andy passed, but really the bulk of this was done 08 to 12.
And when did she pass?
She put in 2012.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, so just that sort of 4-year period.
Yeah.
And this wasn't the only work she was making in that period. She was also doing oil paintings, the kind of incredible output, given that this is in the immediate aftermath of the loss of her husband, and that she's also, paying for the mortgage on the house and also an apartment in Brooklyn. It was an intense period.
I have a question as to your relationship with Cindy. How old were you? Were you close?
Yeah, so Cindy was my aunt and my godmother. How old was I? I was 19 when she passed. And yeah, we're close. I think that's what led me into doing this project. She always paid attention. We were always, even though she lived in Brooklyn or Calhoun, she was mailing me CDs and things. We were emailing about what we were thinking about listening to. So yeah.
So probably a very obvious question, but earlier you were mentioning some of Cindy's works, especially the works, I kind of pointed this out when I was looking in my head to some of the works that particularly have like the moths being preserved in the paintings, in the images, and I think there's one with an owl pelt as well, which is like crazy and beautiful at the same time. You mentioned the word returning, so is that sort of and I guess it's kind of hard to also obviously speak for any artist's intent, whether they're present in the room or not, right? But would you say, as someone who was close to Cindy, that this might have been her way of saying, kind of using art as an act of preservation? preserving a part, something they, you know, kind of preserving part of what they believe in, as a lot of places preserve insect life in various museums, in that same sense where she's preserving a part of her life in this work through using the means of nature and the dead to kind of reveal that.
Yeah, there's an interesting, your question reminds me of an interesting passage in Nancy, your essay, where you're talking about an ambivalence in this body of work that is acknowledging maybe death and decay and precarity, but there's also a lot of resilience and strength, maybe even strength borrowed from nature. So maybe, I don't know if you want to answer to that too, but.
Yeah, I don't think I can really add to that. I think it's, the artistic drive in people is something that is really inarticulate for many, and you know, Andy was not someone who talked very much about his work, and obviously Cindy was the same. So they have to, I've worked with a number of artists who say, the work speaks for itself, I don't have a statement, I can't talk about it. And so this sense that the art symbolically has to represent feelings and perhaps some autobiographical details, but it's put out there for others to engage with. So any kind, whether they make it available through exhibitions or publications or not, there is this sense of trying to connect through a visual language. And I think that is at the heart of the work.
Any final questions?
There's such a presence in her work. It's just so intense, you know. It's like she wants to be seen, you know. And just all the aspects of reality that it shows.
Well, that maybe is a good place to end on, because I agree, I think this is work that wants to be seen. This is also the first time Cindy's work has been exhibited in 35-ish years. So my last question to you, Nancy, is where do we go from here?
Well, I think any sort of promotion, sharing word about her. This is the last day of this exhibit, so too late to tell other people to come in. But certainly there are examples illustrated in Aiden's book. And I think, you know, hopefully you can help get the word out to other museums and places so that we develop a kind of momentum of recognizing Cindy Suffoletto as a very wonderful artist that needs a little more attention.
Well, thanks for helping to bring some of that attention. Thanks for all of these wonderful connections you made, and thanks everybody for coming.